They said the cane still bled at night, as if the roots remembered what the men buried beneath them had whispered. When the wind passed through those stalks, it carried names that no one dared speak after dark. The fields of St. Maurice plantation stretched farther than the eye could bear, rows of cane shimmering like knives beneath the moonlight, trembling with a secret the soil could not bury. At dusk, they glowed a strange rusted hue, as if lit from below by something not of this earth. The slaves used to say the ground there ate sound, that if you cried out long enough, your voice would not echo but sink. No bird sang above the cane. No crickets dared. The air held its breath. Even the frogs at the bayou edge croaked once, then went still, as if the night had laid its hand across their throats. Old men in the quarters remembered when the field was new, when it was first cleared from swamp and rot and consecrated by blood. The master, a Frenchman named Augustin Delarue, had boasted that he built his fortune on the richest soil in Louisiana. But rich soil, the old midwives said, always comes at a price. They said when the slaves dug the first trenches for irrigation, the earth bled clear water at first, then darkened. It smelled of iron and something else, something animal. One man tried to wash his hands in it and found the stains would not leave his skin, even after weeks. He was the first to go missing. At night, the women whispered his name into their skirts so the children wouldn't hear. The men just looked toward the field and crossed themselves in silence. That evening, in 1854, the moon hung swollen and heavy, a white bruise above the field. The new overseer, a pale man from Charleston with eyes like chipped glass, was the first to walk the rows after dark. Superstition, he spat, swinging his lantern, is the curse of the weak. But the flame in his lantern did not hold steady. It flickered like breath upon a mirror, dimming each time the wind moved through the cane. The stalks rustled, whispering something in a rhythm measured to be chants. It almost sounded like a prayer, or a counting. 1, 2, 3. He froze. No one was there. Only the cane, swaying in the windless dark. He took a step forward, boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. It felt warm beneath his soles, as if a fire slept under the earth. Then he heard it, a low hum, not from the insects, but from the soil itself. It rose, faint but pulsing, like breath beneath the ground. He knelt and pressed his ear to the dirt. Something shifted. He stood quickly, heart thrumming. "Who's there?" he called. His voice cracked the silence, but the echo never came back. The field swallowed it whole. Then came the drip. He looked down. His boots were wet. The soil beneath him had turned dark, a slick red-black that glimmered beneath the lantern light. Blood. He stumbled backward, falling into the cane. The stalks scraped his arms, tearing through his sleeves. He thought he saw movement between them, something crouched low, something listening. But when he raised his lantern, there was only the soft rustle of leaves and the whispering count again, faster this time. 1, 2, 3, 4. He dropped the lantern. The flame died on impact. The counting stopped. In the quarters, the slaves heard him scream only once, a sound too high for a man, cut off mid. The dogs would not go near the field until morning. When they found the overseer at dawn, he was standing upright in the middle of the cane, eyes open, mouth filled with soil. His boots had melted into the ground. His skin looked gray, as though something had drained the heat from him. The master said it was madness, or fever. He burned the cane near where they found the body, and the smoke that rose was not black, but pale and slow, like the breath of the dying. Weeks passed. The overseer's replacement refused to enter the field after sunset. The harvest grew thick, impossibly fast, and when cut, the stalks leaked a thin red fluid that stained the workers' hands for days. No matter how many times they washed, the scent of iron lingered. Children said they saw shapes moving between the rows, faces half-formed, shifting as if the stalks themselves were learning to mimic the living. The old ones warned the young, never look the cane in the eye. They said if you did, you'd see your own reflection, not as you are, but as the earth remembers you. By the time winter came, the ground around the field was soft and uneven, like something beneath was breathing. The workers began to notice their footprints filling slowly after each step. The more they walked, the more the earth seemed to rise to meet them. And then one night, when the moon was gone, the field whispered a new sound. Not counting, not wind, but laughter, low, wet, gurgling laughter, like a man with mud in his lungs. The master heard it from his veranda and went pale. His daughter, sitting beside him in white silk, tilted her head. "Papa," she whispered, "they're awake again." He turned to her, but she was already watching the field. The whites of her eyes gleamed faintly red in the dark. That was the night. The field earned its name. They said afterward that sleep never touched it again. Not the wind, not the soil, not the dead. and if you stood at the edge at midnight and called a name, any name, the field would whisper it back to you, in a voice that sounded like forgiveness, until you stepped closer, then it would stop forgiving. The field that never slept is only the first wound of this story, a seed buried deep. What grows from it will make you question what roots still move beneath your feet. If you dare to follow the whispers further into St. Maurice Plantation, subscribe to Chains and Shadows, where the forgotten still speak, and some of them remember your name. He was not born into bondage, he was forged into it, and when the last link broke, something older than man's cruelty stepped out from within him. They said his name was Josiah, though names on the St. Maurice Plantation carried less meaning than dust. They were worn, traded, forgotten, replaced, but Josiah's name endured, not on ledgers or headstones, but in whispers that trembled like the candle flame in the slave quarters whenever the wind pressed against the shutters. He was quiet, the kind of quiet that made other men uneasy. They said he could hear through walls, that he could taste metal in the air before lightning struck, that his eyes were the color of the Mississippi before a flood, dark, restless, full of things unspoken. From his first day on the plantation, the others knew something was wrong. The iron collar around his neck had no lock, no seam, no key. When he was brought in from the Charleston market, the trader swore it was only a symbol, a relic for control. But every night, when the others slept, Josiah's chains would hum softly, like a tuning fork pressed against bone. At first, the overseers mocked him for it. They called him the bellman. They tied him near the stables to keep him away from the others, but still, that low vibration filled the night air, an invisible resonance that made the horses kick their stalls and the dogs wail. Then, one morning, they found the blacksmith dead. His hands were burned to the bone, his mouth frozen open as if caught mid. The iron tools in his shed were twisted, warped like wax, and Josiah's collar, once dull, gleamed faintly red, as though something inside it had just cooled. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried a slow, grave rhythm, like a sermon told from a place deeper than faith. They think they forged these chains, he said one evening to a young girl named Mariah, who'd come to bring him water, but they only found what was already waiting. She didn't understand, none of them did. When he slept, he murmured in a language no one knew, a tongue too old, too heavy for human throats. The women said he was talking to the ground. The men said he was talking through it, and sometimes, when he woke, his collar would be warm. The master, Augustin Delarue, had taken interest in him, not as a man, but as a curiosity. He would visit Josiah's post at dawn, studying the iron like a scholar examining relics of saints. He called it a marvel of metallurgy. "Tell me," he said one morning, brushing the dust from Josiah's shoulder, "do you remember who put it there?" Josiah's eyes rose slowly. "You did," he said. Delarue laughed. No, my boy. I purchased you with it. I never made the thing." Josiah's voice deepened, almost like a growl. "Then you purchased something you don't own." The master's smile faltered. "You forget yourself." Josiah said nothing more, but when Delarue turned away, the iron links around Josiah's wrists trembled, not from movement, but from sound. The faint ring of metal against metal, like chains being tested. That night, the air refused to cool. The cane fields hissed with unseen insects, and thunder grumbled far off over the river. Inside the quarters, the slaves lay awake, too still, too aware. Something pressed on their chests, not weight, but memory. Josiah was gone from his post. They found the chain that held him, still wrapped around the stake, but the iron had fused into the wood, melted and reformed into shapes that looked almost human, almost skeletal. Mariah swore she saw him walking toward the field, the moonlight glinting off his collar like a second face. She followed at a distance, barefoot, her heart thundering louder than the sky. He walked until he reached the burnt edge of the cane where the overseer had died. He knelt there and pressed his palms to the earth. The ground pulsed once, twice. Then again she heard a faint sound, the slow creak of a shackle unlocking, a groan that seemed to come from below the soil itself. Then came the whisper, hundreds of voices at once, overlapping, buried deep but rising. "Josiah." The wind lifted, and the field bent all at once, the stalks bowing toward him. Mariah turned to run, but the air had thickened. Each step felt like moving through honey. She looked back once and saw him standing, the iron collar now split in two, the edges smoking faintly. Something glowed beneath his skin, faint veins of light crawling up his neck. His eyes rolled white as he spoke in that same ancient tongue. Behind him, the field began to move, not with wind, but with shapes. Shapes that were once men, or something like them. They rose from the furrows, dripping black earth, faces hollow, limbs trembling with memory. By morning, Josiah had returned to his post, eyes half open, silent. His chains were whole again, cold and perfect. The master found him there and struck him across the face, shouting for explanation, for defiance, for anything that would make sense. But Josiah only turned his head slowly, and in the stillness between them, the links around his wrists rang again, soft, deliberate, like the toll of a funeral bell. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. De La Rue frowned. "Hear what?" "Them," Josiah said. "They never stopped working." Before the master could respond, the sound filled the yard, faint clinking from the fields, the sound of 1,000 unseen chains dragging through the cane. The workers looked up from their rows. Their shackles had begun to hum. Some said they could feel the links vibrate beneath their skin. The ghost of iron long since removed, the field trembled, and the air stank of metal and old rain. Josiah smiled for the first time. That was the last night anyone slept on St. Maurice. For every chain ever broken had learned how to move on its own. When the moon rose again, it shone on a plantation that looked almost human, the cane swaying like ribs, the wind singing through invisible manacles, and the faint sound of breathing beneath the soil. The chains had been removed long ago, but the field knew better. It had only hidden them. She moved through the manor like a ghost wearing silk. Her smile had no warmth, only pity for the living, and loyalty to the thing that waited in the barn. There were whispers, of course, whispers that spread through the quarters like smoke through cracks, quiet, trembling, uncertain if they spoke of a girl or an omen. They said the master's daughter, Evelyn De La Rue, had been born without color in her eyes, two pale discs that reflected nothing but candlelight. When she was a child, her mother had tied ribbons over them, swearing it was to shield her from the sun. But everyone in St. Maurice knew the truth. Light avoided her, and shadows followed her willingly. By the time she was 17, she had learnt not to blink. She moved slowly, gracefully, as though every step was being watched from somewhere unseen. The slaves called her La Fille d'Ivoire, the ivory girl, for she looked carved, not born, and she never once crossed the threshold of the barn at daylight. The manor was grand, but sick. Its walls breathed. The wallpaper peeled in thin curls that resembled the shedding of old skin. Mirrors fogged even when no one exhaled near them. And through it all, Evelyn drifted, not walking, but gliding, her silk gown whispering over the warped floors. Sometimes she would stop in the hallways and press her ear against the walls, listening. The servants said she could hear something moving within them, something that paced with her, step for step, heartbeat for heartbeat. Her father, Augustin de La Rue, forbade the slaves to speak her name. "You will show her respect," he would snarl. "She is delicate, touched by God." But behind his voice was fear, the kind a man learns only after hearing prayers answered the wrong way. A storm rose from the river, the kind that made the bayou breathe steam and turned the sky into veins of white fire. The house groaned as the wind pressed against it, and every candle trembled. Evelyn stood at her window, eyes wide open, unblinking, watching the rain carve paths down the glass. "Papa," she whispered without turning, "they're calling again." Augustin froze in the doorway. His whiskey sloshed against the rim of his glass. "Who, child?" She turned to face him, her pale eyes glimmering faintly in the candlelight. "The ones you buried beneath the barn." He dropped the glass. "Evelyn," he rasped, "those are old lies. You must not." She tilted her head. "They say you lied to them. They say they're still hungry." The storm grew stronger. The barn door outside banged open and shut, though no wind reached it. The servants crossed themselves and whispered prayers they hadn't used since Africa. Inside her room, Evelyn began to hum a soft, lilting tune, half lullaby, half dirge. The melody was older than her, older than the house, older even than the blood that darkened the soil behind. "The sugar mill," she hummed until the thunder stopped answering. And when silence fell, the sound of dripping began, slow, deliberate, as though something inside the barn had started to breathe again. The next morning the sky was clear, unnaturally so. The air felt clean but wrong, like the world had been scrubbed too hard. The slaves found the barn door wide open, the hay inside blackened, the smell of iron thick in the air. Evelyn was already there, standing in the center, barefoot. Her gown, once white, was stained at the hem with something dark. Around her lay the remnants of chains, 8 lengths, broken, coiled like dead serpents on the floor. She turned when she heard footsteps. "You shouldn't come in," she said softly, voice calm, eyes serene. The housekeeper, an old woman named Nanette who had nursed her as an infant, stepped forward, trembling. "Miss Evelyn, what's done here?" Evelyn's gaze fell upon her like cold rain. "What's always been done. I just let it finish." Nanette's eyes darted to the rafters. For a moment she thought she saw shapes hanging there, not quite men. not quite shadows suspended, twitching gently, as though caught between breaths. Then, one by one, they began to vanish. For days afterward, the house smelled of damp earth. The dogs refused to enter the yard. Flies gathered near the well, though there was no water drawn. Evelyn said little, except to ask her father each morning, "Did you dream of them?" He did. He dreamed of men whose mouths had been sewn shut with wire, of the barn burning but never collapsing, of his daughter, sitting in the ashes, whispering to something that crouched behind her, unseen but smiling. He began to age in days, his skin sinking against his bones, his hair turning the color of ash. He stopped eating, stopped drinking, yet the house still served him. Food appeared at his table. Wine refilled itself, and Evelyn would sit across from him, smiling faintly as he trembled. "Papa," she said one evening, as cicadas screamed outside, "the chains never wanted to hold them. They wanted to hold you." His hand shook as he reached for his rosary, but the beads had turned black. She reached across the table, placing her cold hand over his. "It's all right," she whispered. "They'll forgive you when you remember their names." That night, the manor's lights went out. Every window went black. From the fields came the sound of singing slow, low, rising from 100 throats that had no air to give. The servants fled. Some said they saw Evelyn walking among the cane, her gown trailing over the dirt like mist. Others swore she was standing in the upstairs window, watching herself leave. When dawn came, the house stood silent, but the barn door had shut itself. Those who dared open it swore the floor was damp, that the walls pulsed faintly, and that something whispered when you breathed inside. They said Evelyn still went there every night, barefoot, whispering lullabies to whatever lived beneath the boards, and if you listened close enough through the cracks, you could hear it whisper back in her voice. When the whip cracked, the walls answered. By dawn, the overseer's tongue was gone, and the air smelled like burnt copper. It began with a scream that wasn't human, not animal, not wind, not even pain, but something deeper, sharper, older than either. It rolled through the cane fields and struck the windows of the St. Maurice Manor like a pulse. Every pane trembled, every candle faltered, the slaves in the quarters froze mid. Even the insects stopped. The overseer, Mr. Blaine Holler, was known for his cruelty. His voice was iron, his smile salt. He whipped for sound, not punishment, and claimed the echo of it in the fields kept the devil busy. But that night, the devil was listening. The sun had gone down red, the kind of red that seeps rather than sets. Holler had dragged Josiah, the silent one with the unbreakable chains, to the whipping post near the barn. The others watched from the shadows, too afraid to breathe, too familiar with the rhythm of his violence to hope it would stop. But the rhythm did stop, not because of mercy, because something answered. When the first strike fell, the air did not split clean, it rippled. The sound shivered through the boards of the barn and into the ground itself, as if the earth flinched. Holler paused, blinked. The second lash drew no blood, only silence. The whip struck Josiah's back, but instead of the usual crack, there came a low hum, like a bow drawn across a string. The whip began to tremble in his hand, vibrating, alive. "What in?" he started, but the handle seared his palm. He dropped it, watching in disbelief as the leather coiled on the ground like a snake. The field wind rose without warning, bending the cane in one direction, toward the barn. The horses shrieked, the chains on the walls clinked softly, and Josiah, still bound, lifted his head. His lips parted, not in pain, but in something close to recognition. "She's awake," he whispered. The overseer staggered back. "Who's awake, boy?" Josiah's eyes rolled white. "The one you struck when you struck me." Those who lived near the barn swore later that the night went longer than it should have. The clock on the wall stopped at midnight and stayed there until dawn. Inside the quarters, a baby began to cry. The mother hushed it, shaking, for she could hear it too. The sound of something moving inside the walls. A faint, steady drag. Then, from the direction of the barn, came another crack, but this time, no hand held the whip. It cracked again, and again, each sound closer, heavier, as though the air itself had learned the motion. The slaves pressed their hands over their ears, but the noise passed through skin and bone alike, a splitting, singing tone that made the rafters quiver and the ground pulse like a heartbeat. The old man, Solomon, crossed himself. "It's the blood," he murmured. "The fields drink in what it was owed." When they found Holler's body the next morning, it was still standing. Not upright standing. His boots were rooted in the earth, fused to the ground by something black and glossy. His tongue was missing, and his throat had been flayed in a perfect line, as though traced by something surgical, deliberate. The whip was wrapped around his neck, tightened into a single, seamless band of leather. Its tip had fused into the post. no one could remove it. The master arrived at dawn, pale and silent, the smell of whiskey clinging to his breath. He stood before the sight for a long time, saying nothing. The morning light made the whip shimmer faintly, as if it were wet. Finally, he spoke. Who saw this? No one answered. Who heard it? Still nothing. Only the creak of the boards and the low hum that hadn't stopped since nightfall. The master's daughter, Evelyn, stood at the window above, her pale eyes fixed on the field. The house did, she said softly. The walls have been listening all night. That day the air refused to settle. The cane stalks swayed without wind, as if moved by some slow rhythm beneath the soil. In the quarters, the workers refused to speak above a whisper. Even laughter, the smallest sound of life, seemed to anger the silence that followed. Josiah was gone. The chains that bound him lay on the ground, bent open, but there was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away, only a black scorch in the dirt, faintly shaped like a man lying down. Maria, the young girl who used to bring him water, found something half buried near the post, a splinter of bone, smooth as glass, humming when held. She ran to show the others, but by the time she reached the quarters, the hum had stopped. She buried it near the well. That night, the water turned the color of iron. By the second night, the humming returned, louder now, pulsing in the rafters and through the walls. The sound of dragging metal echoed across the yard. The whip, still hanging from the post, began to move. No one touched it. It uncoiled itself, inch by inch, rising like smoke. The barn door creaked open, and inside, the air glowed faintly, a dull red shimmer, as if the ground were breathing embers. The master ordered the slaves to seal the barn, to nail it shut with boards and press. They obeyed, but the hammering made no sound. Every strike vanished, swallowed whole. And when they stepped back, the boards were already splitting. The overseer's shadow was still there on the floor, darker than dark, stretched, mouth open in silent scream. That night, the cane rustled with whispers that sounded like singing, low, broken, rhythmic, as though hundreds of unseen mouths were calling the same name. Josiah single quotes as, in the months that followed, no one whipped another soul on sing, not because of mercy, but because every whip, every switch, every lash brought from town turned soft in their hands, melting into ribbons before a single blow could fall. They said the fields had learned the sound of pain, and now, they sang it back. They said the whip remembered every strike, every scream, every plea, and it was still singing. And if you walked past the barn on a still night, when the air hung heavy and red with heat, you could still hear it, faint, rhythmic, patient, crack, 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 but there was no echo anymore, only answers. They said the soil there pulsed, and when she knelt beneath it, her breath slowed until it matched the rhythm of something ancient beneath the earth. It was said that the willow at the edge of the fields had been planted by a grieving woman long before the war, before the first chain clinked on the property, before the first child was born in bondage. No one knew her name. They only said that when her husband's body was found hanged from its branches, the sap had turned dark and thick as blood, and the roots drank too eagerly of what the river brought down from the hills. By the time the daughter with the milk-pale eyes came of age, the willow had grown monstrous, its limbs arched like a mourner's spine, its leaves heavy with midnight dew. The slaves were forbidden to go near it. The master said it was cursed land, but curses only grow where something sacred has already been broken. That night, the air was thick enough to drink. Cicadas had gone silent. The moon hung low and swollen, veiled in mist that drifted from the cane rows like the breath of the dead. The daughter walked barefoot across the wet soil, her white nightgown trailing behind her like a shroud. She carried no lantern, for the tree itself seemed to glow faintly, not with light, but with something that hummed low, alive, waiting behind her, hidden among the shadows. The slave who once bore chains followed. His steps made no sound, his skin swallowed by the dark. He had been watching her for days, ever since the barn began to smell like candle wax and rot, ever since she began whispering to the air as though someone whispered back. When she reached the willow, she sank to her knees, pressing her hands into the black soil. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but recognition. "Do you feel it?" she murmured, as though speaking to the wind. The man did not answer. He only watched the ground beneath her palms begin to move, that it was subtle at first, a slow pulse, a heartbeat in the earth. Then came a low groan like wood, twisting under weight, and the willow's branches began to sway, though no wind stirred. The air changed, thickened, warped, carrying a scent of rust, rain, and something sweetly rotten. She whispered again, this time in a language that had never belonged to the South, nor to the living. Each word seemed to thrum inside his bones, calling something from beneath. And then the ground opened not wide, just enough for a breath, a sigh, a memory to escape. The soil churned, and for a moment he saw the glimmer of something beneath it, a shape, cold and trembling, like a man folded into himself. The daughter did not recoil. She leaned closer, her hair falling over her face, and placed her ear against the dirt. "He's still awake," she said softly, almost lovingly. The man behind her felt his stomach twist. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice dry from disuse. She turned to him slowly, her pale eyes reflecting nothing of the night. "None of us should," she said, but the earth gave another shudder. Roots began to rise, not like branches, but like hands. Thin, wet, clawing, they reached for her wrists, for her throat, and she did not fight them. Her lips parted in a slow, dazed smile as the black sap began to drip from the tree above, pattering onto her shoulders, her face, her open mouth. The man stepped forward, seized her arm, and yanked her away, but when his hand met her skin, he felt the pulse again. It wasn't hers. It came from within the soil, traveling up her veins like heat. Her eyes flickered with something new, something not her own. "He's angry," she whispered. "You broke him when you broke me." He stumbled back, his breath ragged. "Who?" Her smile widened. "The one who remembers the lash." A gust tore through the clearing then, ripping leaves from the willow like torn veils. The branches swayed violently, their tips lashing the air like whips, and from deep within the roots came a groan that rose into a scream, the sound of metal on bone, of iron splitting skin. The ground heaved, something beneath it shifted, large and restless. The pulse grew stronger, a rhythm like marching feet, like 1,000 heartbeats buried alive and beating still. The man fell to his knees, clutching his ears as the sound pressed against his skull. The girl stood perfectly still, her body swaying slightly, her gaze fixed on the tree as if awaiting permission, and then she spoke again, voice low and trembling. "He's coming back to finish the work." The willow cracked down the middle, sap pouring from its wound like black blood. The smell of burnt copper filled the air. When the man opened his eyes, she was gone. Only her footprints remained in the mud, small, barefoot, leading straight into the open slit of the earth where the roots breathed like lungs. The sound of the pulse faded slowly into silence, but the ground beneath him still moved, steady and patient. He rose unsteadily, his eyes drawn to the hollow that swallowed her, and for the first time, he noticed something he hadn't before: bones, dozens of them, pale and glinting between the roots, tangled with rusted chains that pulsed faintly like veins of light. He turned to flee, but the willow groaned again, its shadow stretching toward him like an arm, and then, from the hollow, came her voice, soft, distant, soaked in dirt and memory. "Tell him the chains were never removed." The earth closed with a wet sigh, and the pulse went still. The man fell to his knees, trembling, as the first drop of black rain fell from the willow's hanging leaves, slow, deliberate, like the beginning of a baptism that no one had asked for. And beneath it, the roots began to hum again, as though counting down to something's return. They came one by one, barefoot and silent, not as men, but as echoes of those the master had buried in shame, each carrying a memory carved in bone. The air that night hung thick as syrup, clinging to the throat and heavy with the scent of rain and sugar rot. The manor sat like a corpse in its shroud of vines, every window blind, every candle drowned. Yet inside, the table was set. Plates of silver dulled with tarnish gleamed faintly beneath the trembling flame of 8 half-burned candles. The chairs, once symbols of power, were empty, waiting. It was the daughter who had arranged it all. The white linen, the decayed fruit, the cups brimming with something dark enough to be mistaken for wine. Her eyes were no longer milk pale, but black as the soil beneath the willow, and her smile was stretched thin, almost reverent. She hummed as she worked, a low, wordless tune that carried through the halls like a forgotten hymn. When she was done, she stood at the head of the table and whispered, "They will come soon," and they did first. The doors of the dining hall creaked open, though no wind stirred them. A figure entered barefoot, his skin gray as ash, his body traced with marks that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. His eyes were not eyes at all, but hollow places where the light dared not enter. He said nothing as he took his seat, his hand resting gently upon the table. Then came another, and another after that. 8 in all. Each bore something in his hands, relics of memory, tokens of what had been taken: a shard of a broken collar, a child's doll made of rags, a whip handle, a rosary blackened by fire, a torn hymn book, a nail bent into a ring, a blood-stained ribbon, and a small carved bone still slick with earth. They placed their offerings in the center of the table, one atop the other, until the pile looked less like remembrance and more like an altar built from grief itself. The candles flickered violently, as though the air recoiled from their presence. The shadows on the walls began to move, slow and deliberate, stretching higher, deeper, until they no longer belonged to the forms that cast them. The daughter bowed her head. "You were promised justice," she whispered, her voice trembling with something between devotion and terror. "And tonight, you will eat." The shadows shuddered, bending toward her. She reached for the nearest goblet and raised it to her lips, the liquid within thick and red as rusted water. "Drink," she said softly, her voice splitting into echoes. "Remember what they took." One by one, the figures obeyed. The sound of swallowing filled the silence like distant thunder. Then came the music. It began low. The hum of something beneath the floorboards, the moan of wood that remembered blood. It swelled, rising into a rhythm older than prayer. The candles dimmed until their light was little more than a heartbeat pulsing in the dark. The daughter swayed where she stood, her movements gentle at first, then erratic, almost convulsive. Her hands trembled as she lifted the covered platter at the center of the table. Beneath it lay not food, but flesh, pale, raw, and arranged with a cruel precision. The 8 shadows leaned forward, their faces drawn close, their hollow eyes reflecting the faint light like wet stones. "This was his," she said. "The master's. He fed on your bodies. Tonight, you feed on his sin." The shadows began to move their mouths, but the sound that came out was not human speech. It was a low, grinding murmur, the language of things buried too long. They tore into the offering with hands that dissolved and reformed in the candlelight. The sound was soft but obscene, like teeth on wet cloth. The daughter stood among them, trembling, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "He will feel it," she whispered. "Wherever he hides, he will taste what he gave." But the master was already there. He had come down from his room when he heard the noise, half drunk, half dreaming, and what he saw froze him mid-step. The hall before him was alive with darkness, the air thick with decay and sweet rot. The figures at the table turned their heads in unison toward him, faces slick with something that wasn't blood. The daughter raised her eyes slowly, her mouth curling into that thin, wrong smile. "Father," she breathed, "your guests have arrived." He stumbled back, clutching at the wall. "What is this? Who are people?" But his voice broke. He recognized them. Every one. Men he had whipped, women he had buried, children he had sold. They were thinner now, their faces sunken, their bodies blurred at the edges, but the eyes, or what remained of them, were the same. He tried to flee, but his feet routed themselves to the ground. One of the shadows rose, moving with slow, inevitable grace. It reached across the table, picked up the whip handle from the altar, and placed it before him. The master's breath came in gasps. "Please," he croaked. The daughter tilted her head, her voice soft as silk. "He's asking again," she said. The shadow leaned close, its face inches from his. "We remember," it whispered, 1,000 voices behind the words. Then the candles went out. The room erupted into sound, 1,000 chains dragging across wood, a scream swallowed by laughter, the wet crack of something breaking. When the light returned, the chairs were empty. The plates were clean. Only the daughter remained, sitting at the table's head, her hair matted with sweat and shadow. Before her, on the tablecloth, lay the master's tongue curled like a dead worm beside the goblet. She lifted it with trembling fingers, staring at it with something close to tenderness. Then she placed it back on the altar, beside the relics of the dead, and whispered, "The feast has only begun." The house groaned in answer. The windows shuddered as if breathing. From beneath the floorboards came the steady thump of something massive, not footsteps, not heartbeat, but both. The daughter closed her eyes and smiled faintly. Outside, the willow began to sway again, its roots shifting in the black soil. For the first time, the wind seemed to carry voices, 8 of them humming, the same dirge that rose from the earth the night. The whip sang back, and when the last candle guttered out, the room did not fall silent. It whispered softly, almost tenderly. He was tied to the chair that his father once used to read scripture, but this night, scripture was replaced with sound, soft, rhythmic, inhuman, and his faith began to rot. The chair was older than the house. Its legs were carved from cypress, smooth from decades of hands that had prayed, pleaded, and struck the air when words alone would not suffice. The master's father had called it the reading chair, and each night, he would sit there beneath the flicker of oil light, reciting verses meant to tame the trembling souls that served his land. But now the son sat bound in it, wrists lashed with belts of leather that once tethered the faithful. The air in the room was close, crawling with heat and the scent of mildew. The shutters were drawn, yet the candlelight trembled, disturbed by a rhythm too slow to be wind. It began in the walls, low and deliberate, a pulse, a pattern, like breath, but not quite. He strained against his bindings, the chair groaning beneath him. The wood felt alive, as if it breathed with him or against him. His eyes darted to the corners of the room where the shadows gathered thick as tar. There had been a time, not long ago, when this room had been his refuge. His father's voice, grave and holy, had filled it with order. Now, the silence carried something else, something that waited to be acknowledged. He licked his lips, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" The sound that answered was neither human nor animal. It came as a whisper folded within another whisper, a sound like teeth scraping on stone. The candle flame bent toward the chair, and then, softly, from the far corner, a voice, a woman's, began to hum. The melody was slow, circular, like a lullaby that had lost its words. He recognized it. It was the same tune the slaves once sang while harvesting cane beneath the sun. His father had forbidden it, saying the melody carried something unholy, that it had been written not to soothe children, but to summon memory itself. "Stop," he croaked. "Stop that song." But the humming continued, closer now, though no figure moved. The sound crept up the walls, into the floorboards, vibrating through the soles of his feet. The candlelight dimmed, stretched, and split. For a heartbeat, the room appeared to double, one atop the other, as though he was sitting inside two overlapping realities. In one, he was bound, sweating, afraid. In the other, the room was full of faces that watched him from every wall. Men, women, children, all pale, all silent. Their eyes had no color, only a wet gleam that reflected his trembling. The master's breath caught. He recognized them. Every soul he had punished in this room. Everybody his father had forced to kneel before scripture until the blood on the floor turned to ink. Their mouths did not move, but he heard them whisper all the same, "Read to us." He shook his head violently, the chair rattling. "No, I burned the book." The candle hissed, spitting wax. "Read." The words slithered through him like a command he could not defy. Against his will, his gaze fell to the table before him. There, where his father's Bible once lay, rested another book, thick, bound in something that glistened wetly in the firelight. Its pages were yellowed, curled, and breathing. The cover bore no title, only a symbol, a hand pressed into the leather. Its fingers burned deep as if seared there from the inside. He tried to look away, but the book opened on its own. The pages fluttered violently, the air around it humming with low vibration. Then it stopped, and from within came the same sound he'd heard in the walls. The rhythm, the breath. A voice began to speak, but it was his own. "In the beginning there was the wound," it said, trembling, and the wound remembered. He felt something wet on his wrists. The leather straps were bleeding. The shadows around him deepened until the air turned the color of bruises. The figures on the walls leaned closer, their faces elongating, their features unraveling into the shapes of what they once were: hands, ropes, scars. The humming woman's voice shifted into words, distant and broken. "Do you remember the ones who prayed beneath your window, master? Do you remember how you told them silence was devotion?" He gasped, jerking his head toward the sound. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, softly, "The one who learned to listen." He saw her then faint, wavering, standing just behind the candlelight. Her dress was soaked to the knees, her skin gray with the color of clay. Her eyes were open but blind, her mouth moving gently as if reciting the same words over and over. She stepped closer, and the sound returned. That rhythmic pulse. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from her. From beneath her ribs he watched horror spreading across his face, as her chest rose and fell to that impossible beat, not a heartbeat, but the echo of the whip, each strike slow and endless. She knelt before him. The candlelight trembled. "He read to me once," she whispered, "before he buried me beneath the willow." The master tried to speak, but his voice was gone. Only a dry rattle left his throat. The woman reached out, placing her hand against his chest. Her touch was cold, almost tender. "You will read again," she said, "and this time, we will listen." The book before him began to glow faintly, its pages curling, the words shifting like worms beneath the surface. He could not look away. His lips moved of their own accord, mouthing the words as they crawled up from the page, words that had never been written by man. With each line he spoke, the walls seemed to breathe, exhaling a black mist that gathered above the candle, twisting into shapes that resembled the 8 shadows from the feast. The chair creaked, the bindings tightening, cutting deeper into his flesh. The smell of iron filled the room. His voice cracked into a sob. "Please," he gasped, "forgive me." The woman tilted her head, her blind eyes reflecting the candle's last light. "There is no forgiveness in a room that still watches," she whispered. The candle guttered, hissed, and went out. For a moment, there was silence, pure and absolute. Then came the scraping of wood against stone. He could not move, but he felt it, the chair dragging itself backward, deeper into the darkness. The walls shuddered, the sound rising until it became a shriek of timber and bone, and just before the dark consumed him entirely, he saw it, the book closing slowly on its own, sealing his voice inside it. When the door opened the next morning, the room was empty. The chair stood alone, still wet. The faint outline of a man burned into its seat. On the table, the Bible had returned open to a single passage written in an unfamiliar hand. He watched them all, until there was no light left to see, and beneath it, a single page torn loose, pulsing faintly, as if the story inside still hadn't ended. The church had been quiet for 100 years, but that night, it remembered how to breathe. A sound like a sigh moved through its wooden ribs, stirring the dust that had lain undisturbed since the last sermon was whispered through trembling lips. The pews groaned as though some unseen congregation were rising to its feet. The moon hung in the fractured glass above the altar, pale, judgmental, unblinking, and in that silver beam stood her shadow. Mara knelt at the edge of the sanctuary, her hands folded as if in prayer, though the thing she spoke to was not God. The air around her shimmered faintly, as if each word she mouthed carried heat. The smell of wax and something sweeter, like rotting lilies, curled through the chapel. He watched from the doorway, silent, afraid to speak her name aloud. He had known her once, or thought he had, when her hair still smelled of river reeds and her laughter carried through the mill town like a promise. But that was before they found her in the graveyard, barefoot and smiling, whispering to the stones as if they whispered back. Now her face was pale as the marble saints, her lips parted in devotion to something that did not belong in this world. "Mara," he tried, his voice barely more than breath. "Please, stop this." She didn't turn. The candlelight bent strangely across her body, flickering not from wind but from something unseen that breathed beside her. "Do you hear it?" she murmured, her tone soft, reverent, almost childlike. The hymn they never finished singing. He took a step forward, and the floor moaned beneath his weight. The hymn, if it could be called that, grew louder. It wasn't sung by any mouth he could see, but by the air itself, low and trembling, as though the wood remembered the voices of the congregation long dead. This place was sealed for a reason. She rose slowly, her back straightening with impossible grace. Her hair clung to her face as if drawn by static. The shadows around her gathered like attendants. "They sealed it because they were afraid," she whispered. "But fear doesn't stop a prayer, it only changes who listens." He felt it then, a pulse beneath the floorboards, faint but insistent, like a second heartbeat beneath the church. Every candle flickered once, twice, then flared higher, as if answering her. "Mara, you don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. Turning toward him, her eyes caught the moonlight, glazed with something divine and unclean. They shimmered, not with tears, but with something closer to joy. And then she smiled. It was not the smile he remembered from before the drowning, not the smile she gave when she danced barefoot under the willows. It was a smile stretched too far, too still, as if carved onto her by unseen hands. "Do you remember the river?" she asked. "How they held me under until I stopped moving?" He froze, every word a nail in the coffin of his denial. "Mara, I prayed," she continued, stepping closer, her feet making no sound on the wood. "But it wasn't God who answered. It was what lived beneath him, what watched the prayers that went unanswered too long." Her voice trembled, not with fear but with rapture. "It showed me what mercy really looks like." He could not move. The air had thickened, pressing against his lungs. Her shadow stretched behind her, but the shape of it was wrong. It bent in directions that disobeyed the walls, moving even when she did not. The hymn deepened. From somewhere below the altar came a low, wet sound, a ripple, as though something old and patient were waking from beneath the church. Mara tilted her head, the candlelight catching on her teeth as her smile widened. "Do you know what it said to me?" He could only shake his head, his throat too tight for speech. "It said, the prayer must end in joy." The words fell from her mouth like a benediction. Her arms rose, her fingers trembling as if plucking invisible strings. Every candle in the church flared once more and then turned blue. The saints on the walls seemed to weep. Wax tears melted from their eyes and pooled at their feet. The hymn became a roar, and then he saw them, figures, pale and silent, standing between the pews. Not people, not any more. Their mouths were open in perfect oaths of prayer, but no breath moved within them. Their eyes were hollowed smooth. their faces locked in the same expression that now twisted hers, that smile, too wide, too grateful. He stumbled backward, reaching for the door, but the wood beneath his hand pulsed like flesh. Mara, please, she stepped toward him, her voice soft and merciful. It's all right, it only hurts until you stop asking. He turned to flee, but the door wouldn't yield. Behind him, the pews groaned as the congregation began to move. Their hands rose in unison. Their smiles caught the moonlight and through the crack in the stained glass. The moon poured down like a blade of milk-white fire. It struck Mara full in the face. For the briefest moment, her expression faltered between sorrow and something unspeakable, before the light burned through her eyes and out the other side. Then she was still. The hymn ended. He stood there, trembling, the silence pressing into him like the weight of water. The air stank of wax and river-mud. He thought she was gone. But as he turned, her voice brushed his ear, soft as breath and cold as stone. Don't worry, she whispered. Even he smiled before the flood, and in the reflection of the shattered glass, he saw it, her face behind his, smiling that same impossible smile, the smile that ended the prayer. The house did not want visitors. It had been built on the bones of the marsh, where the ground itself remembers what it swallows. Every nail had rusted with secrets, every board swollen with damp, regret, and blood too thin to stain. When the lawmen came, lanterns trembling in their hands, the fog was so thick it seemed to move with purpose, curling up their legs like a thing that meant to keep them. The first man, Sheriff Gable, spat in the mud and muttered that the place smelled like something had learned to rot twice. His deputy, younger and quieter, said nothing. He only watched the shutters sway as if the house were breathing. The door resisted their touch. It moaned open not from rust, but reluctance. Inside, the air felt heavier, as though it had been held too long without being let out. Every step they took made the boards sigh, then creak, then settle again, but never the same way twice. It sounded almost like something shifting below them, trying to keep still. Been empty since the drowning, Gable whispered, the words dissolving into the dust. No one's lived here since she went under. The deputy glanced around at the walls warped by moisture, at the portrait half hanging over the fireplace. A woman's face, her eyes a shade too bright, her smile carved too gently, as if the painter had loved her too much to paint her true. They found her belongings still there, her shawl, her Bible, her comb, all placed with care, as if she had meant to return. But the bed was untouched, and the hearth was blackened, and in the center of the parlor the floor dipped slightly inward, as though someone had knelt there too long. The deputy crouched, ran his hand across the boards. It's warm, he said softly. Gable frowned. What's that supposed to mean? The deputy lifted his hand. His palm glistened faintly, as if with sweat, but the air was cold enough to bite. Maybe the stovepipe runs under, Gable began, but the deputy shook his head. The warmth came from below, deep, pulsing faintly, like something alive. Then the floor breathed, a slow rise and fall, almost imperceptible, as if the house itself drew in their scent. Gable stepped back. His lantern trembled, the light catching on the portrait. For a moment, it looked as though the woman's painted lips had parted. Get the crowbar, he ordered. If there's an animal trapped under, we'll put it down. But when the deputy pried the first plank loose, the smell that rose wasn't of rot, it was sweet, almost floral, the kind of scent that clings to skin long after the grave. And beneath the wood, they found cloth, a bit of lace, pale and damp, and under that, a hollow space, breathing warm air into the room. God help us, Gable whispered. Something shifted down there, slow, deliberate, followed by a sound no human throat could make. It was not a growl nor a moan. It was something closer to a hum, soft and steady, like a lullaby sung through dirt. The deputy leaned closer, his ear near the gap. There's someone. The board snapped beneath his hand, cutting him off. His lantern fell, shattering. In the brief, dying light, he saw it, something pale moving below the planks. A hand, or what might have once been one, pressing upward, fingers long, nails torn, skin slick and thin as candle wax. The lantern went out. The room plunged into dark. They heard it then, the creaking rhythm beneath their feet. Faster now, heavier, as if the floor itself was breathing harder. Gable's voice cracked against the silence. Is that you? The answer came not in words, but in a sound, a wet whisper through the cracks. Still praying. The deputy screamed, scrambling back, but his boot caught in the hole where the plank had split. Something seized his ankle, soft, but unyielding. He kicked, felt it slide up his leg, cold as river water. Gable fired once. The gunshot tore through the quiet, splitting the night open. The smell of gunpowder mingled with that strange floral scent until it was sickening. When the smoke cleared, the deputy was gone. Only his hat remained, resting beside the open seam in the floor, a thin line of blood tracing the edges of the plank. The sheriff knelt, shaking. "Lord, forgive me," he muttered, and pressed his ear to the wood. From below came that humming again, and beneath it, faintly, a voice that almost sounded like laughter. He staggered to his feet, backing toward the door. The walls seemed to pulse with the same slow rhythm. The portrait above the hearth now hung perfectly straight, and her eyes, her painted eyes, were no longer looking at the horizon, but directly at him. He fled into the fog, stumbling down the rotted steps. Behind him, the door slammed shut without wind, but in the swamp's stillness, he could still hear the floorboards sighing a steady, living breath that never quite stopped. The townsfolk found him at dawn half-mad, muttering about how the house was still remembering her. When they pried open the floor that afternoon, they found no body, no bones, only a hollow space lined with wet lace, and a single handprint pressed into the underside of the boards, as if someone had been reaching up from the dark to touch the world that forgot her that night. The sheriff hung himself in his cell, and the next morning, when they returned to burn the house, the fire would not take that it hissed, it smoked, but the boards only blackened, whispering faintly, as if the flames were listening, and if you stood close enough, you could still hear it. Under the crackle of ash and soot, a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone breathing just beneath your feet, waiting for you to stop moving long enough to listen, waiting to be remembered. They buried him at dawn because that was when the sky looked least alive. The air hung thick and gray, heavy with the taste of iron and wet soil. Even the crows had stayed silent, watching from the skeletal branches above the field as though waiting for permission to speak. The house in the distance loomed hollow and blind, every shutter closed, every window reflecting the faintest, bloodless light of a morning that did not want to come. They said it was the daughter who ordered him buried facing east, a gesture of mercy, or madness. None could agree. She had not wept, only stood beside the grave with her hair unpinned, her eyes pale as unspilled milk, her lips trembling in a rhythm no one recognized. When the preacher spoke, his voice caught. He said the words wrong, ashes to ashes, but the echo that followed came not from his mouth, but from somewhere beneath the ground. The men lowered the coffin slowly, ropes straining like tendons. The box looked too small for a man who had once filled every room with his voice, yet the earth seemed eager, swallowing him quick, soft soil sucking around the edges as if greeting something it had long been promised. One of the diggers crossed himself, another spat in the dirt and muttered, "He won't stay put." The daughter's gaze flickered toward him. "None of us do," she said. The preacher cleared his throat, his fingers trembling over the pages of his Bible. The words on the paper were smudged, as though the ink had bled during the night. He tried to read them anyway, but the syllables came out wrong, curling like smoke from his tongue. By the time the coffin was covered, the sun still hadn't broken the horizon. The light that finally came was colorless, cold, and is still a light that casts no warmth, only truth, and in that truth, they saw it, kneeling beside the grave. At first, they thought it was the daughter, the same white dress, the same pale hair falling loose. But when she stepped forward from the preacher's side, the figure at the grave did not fade. It remained kneeling, head bowed, hands pressed into the mud. "Someone help her," the preacher whispered, but his voice barely carried. But the figure lifted its face. The light caught it then, not the sun, but something like it. Hollow, trembling, almost alive. The face was wrong, stretched too long. The skin shone faintly, as if wet, but not with rain. And when it turned its eyes toward them, they were the same pale color as the daughter's, milk, pure and blind. The air shuddered. The crows broke their silence, erupting from the branches all at once, a black storm tearing through the gray morning. The men stumbled back. The preacher dropped his book. The daughter did not move. She watched the thing at the grave rise, slow, deliberate, like something remembering how to stand. The earth clung to it, threads of mud and grass stretching from its limbs. When it spoke, the voice was one deep and male, the other soft and broken. "We were never done." The preacher screamed a prayer, words collapsing into sobs. The diggers ran, stumbling through the fog, shouting for the road, for God, for anything that still had meaning. But the daughter stepped closer. "Father," she whispered, though it sounded less like love and more like an invocation. "You remember me, don't you?" The figure tilted its head. The mouth opened too wide, and the sound that came was not speech but the echo of the whip, the one that had cracked across the fields so many years before. The same rhythm, the same scream, carried now by something no longer bound by breath. The daughter fell to her knees, smiling through her tears. "I told them you'd come back. The preacher's lantern flickered, the last living fire in that grey dawn. Its light danced over the grave, revealing the soil moving again, sinking inward, as though hands below were clawing their way up to reach her, and she did not pull away. Her white dress darkened as the mud reached her waist, her chest, her throat, but her expression never changed. Her arms opened like a child waiting for an embrace. The preacher ran. He didn't stop until the house was out of sight, until the road vanished behind him, and the only sound left was the distant whisper of the swamp. When he looked back, there was no figure, no grave, only a black shape in the earth that seemed to pulse faintly, like a slow, steady heartbeat. By noon, the fog had not lifted. The light stayed sickly, refusing to turn to day. When the townsfolk returned that evening, they found 2 sets of footprints leading to the grave, and none leading away. The preacher's Bible lay open beside it, the pages bloated with damp. The verse was illegible, except for one fragment that seemed to have darkened deeper into the paper. As though burned there, the dead shall rise incorruptible that night. The plantation went quiet for the first time in years. Not even the wind dared to pass over the fields, but the slaves' quarters, long abandoned, showed signs of movement. Curtains shifted, a door creaked open, then closed again, and those who passed by swore. They saw 2 silhouettes standing at the edge of the marsh, a man and a woman, hand in hand, both facing east, waiting for a sun that would never warm them again. When the light came the next morning, it was not gold. It was red dot, and every drop of dew on the grass looked like it had bloomed from flesh. The grave was empty, and the daughter's pale dress hung from the willow tree, dripping as if something beneath the soil had wrung it dry or claimed what was left of her for its own. The sun had finally risen, but the light that came that morning did not warm the earth. It only revealed what was still kneeling beside his grave.